before we really get started talking about any of this, we need to try to decide what value is. And the reason we need to do this is because money is to represent value, right? That's what money is. It's sort of a I don't know, it's a value that can morph into different types of values. It can be equated to any number of things, and you can exchange it and trade it for all sorts of things, right? So if we're going to start questioning money, we have to kind of step back and say, okay, what is it that we're questioning? What is this? It's something, it's a symbol. We've all agreed on this symbol, and it symbolizes some value. Now, really, the value is kind of up to whatever, because, I mean, you can have, a 100-year-old car that's been restored, and even though it's still like basic, I mean, even the old cars that haven't been restored still go for quite a lot of money, even the ones that don't run. So there's no utility to it. So what is it? What is this value thing? What are we trying to show? Now, when I first started to think about this several years ago, way back when this first came into my mind, I was trying to, I started to try to break it down, physically, not physically, but break it down to its core elements. That's where STEM came from: space, time, energy, and matter. Back then, I didn't call it STEM. I just said, well, nature has 4 fundamental currencies, and it's space, time, energy, and matter. Those are the 4 fundamental, the 4 absolute fundamentals that everything, all flows of everything. That's everything that is included in anything, right? So that's where STEM came from. But it hadn't occurred to me that that has nothing to do with value. And let me explain. And so we're going to talk about value for a second, because this is so important to understanding everything about money, about the 3 functions of money, and how they relate to the 4 laws of thermodynamics, 0th law included. Okay, when we're thinking about value, one of the first things we notice is that value has a heavy temporal component. No matter what it is, something will gain value and then peak, and then most things will just quickly drop off. Not everything, but for the most part, there's a heavy temporal component to what we perceive value as being. Let's take an apple, for example. An apple tree grows, there are no apples, so there's no apple to value yet. Then it blossoms, and the buds begin to, to get fertilized, pollinated, and, you start to have little buds, and then you have apples forming, still green, still small, but, still not really anything of value. You cannot pluck a barely, little baby apple and sell it for any amount of money, unless it was somebody dying of starvation on the street. But at some point, the apple gets large enough and begins to ripen and become sweet, and you can actually pluck it, and then it has value. But it will also lose value extremely rapidly, especially left to the elements. It'll begin to shrivel up and lose its, water retention, and before you know it, it's starting to decompose. So, within a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks, an apple can go from being fully valuable at its peak value to almost worth nothing. So we know there's a temporal component to this, or at least so we think. But then we start looking around, right? We start looking at what gives any one thing value. Okay, so I'm going to make a couple of claims here, and they're going to sound a little bit out there, but stick with me. This is going to make sense by the end. If it doesn't, you can shoot me an email and ask some questions or make a rebuttal, whatever you like. All right, what I have concluded after really kind of breaking everything down is that what we think of as what makes things valuable, like energy, matter, the substance made, the design, whatever, isn't value. In fact, it is so completely divorced from what actual value is that it's kind of, it's kind of mind-boggling that we've continued to use value in the sense that we have. Now, obviously, even I have. And until I made this analysis and started breaking everything down, I didn't realize just how completely off the mark we have been with valuation. So, what is value? Well, what I have determined is that value simply is what makes us feel good. Plain and simple, down to the bare bones, that is what value is. So if we want to kind of rustle up a couple of examples here, we can talk about, food. Food, for example, right? You eat food, it tastes good, candy tastes good, that adds value. The food goes through our body uses it for energy and for sustenance. It uses, it breaks it down into its components and uses the different pieces of the different chemicals and pieces of matter for its own purposes. And so that's what we think value is. We think it's valuable because it gives us energy and it gives us our body's material to work with. But that's not it. Value, as we understand it, requires self-awareness. You have to be a conscious entity to perceive certain things and attach a value to it. So the ultimate breakdown of what value is that value is a function of sentiment. Plain and simple. There is nothing out there that humans have attached value to that can't be broken down to just how it makes you feel. Value is directly proportional to sentiment. Every single thing we have attached value to is sentiment. We're going to come back to this later, but keep this in mind because we're going to be treading on some unfamiliar territory. And even for me, when I began this analysis, I was pretty confused for a minute until I realized that there's a reason for this. However, understanding this relationship, understanding that value is directly proportional to sentiment is key to this lecture series, this 4-part. All right, so the problem is, if we are going to, I jumped ahead of myself. Let's rewind just for a second. Okay, let's kind of go over this in a little bit more detail. Okay, value is how something makes you feel. Now, obviously, when you eat food, as I said earlier, it gives you energy and body materials to work with. But that's not what gives it value. The value comes from how it makes you feel. And I'm not just talking about how it tastes. I'm talking about the fact that we are wired, our brains are totally wired to feel good when we have ingested food, when we're eating the right kind of food. We are wired to feel good when that happens. So the value from the food doesn't come from how efficient our bodies run on it or how much energy we get from it. It comes from the fact that it makes us feel good when we eat it. That we are literally wired to feel good when we eat food that is healthy for us. We are also wired to feel good when we eat things that aren't so healthy for us. It's how our brains react to certain chemicals. High, candy and sugar. We are wired to feel good when we eat candy and sugar. So we have put a value on that. Drugs of abuse, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, alcohol, tobacco. We are wired to feel good when we ingest those chemicals. They may not be good for us, okay? And that right there should show you that value comes from sentiment. It comes from how we feel about stuff. It does not come from what it does for us. You can go a little further and talk about books. Books with, storybooks, fiction. They're good stories. They're stories that we enjoy to read. And the operative word there is enjoy. We read them, we enjoy them. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel excited. It makes us feel adventurous, whatever it is. We attach a value to that book or story or movie or film or whatever because of how it makes us feel. Books of learning, right? Textbooks, college textbooks, middle school and high school textbooks. The value there is the information that we are ingesting that we can turn around and use again. This sort of comes back to, becoming an actualizing individual. That knowing and understanding any one concept makes us feel good when we're working in a group. We feel confident. We feel like we know what we're doing. We get good grades, whatever it is. The value from that comes from how we feel. Okay, so the functions of money, when we're going to look at them through the lens of thermodynamics, we need a way to make a connection here. Because if everything is sentiment, then how on earth are we going to put, break this down? How are we going to take the three functions of money, a system that, is supposed to be basically your unidirectional or multi-directional or multi-vector, valuation system. You can attach any sort of value to it for anything. I mean, it's to be used for exchange, right? So you can exchange it for whatever you want. So it's a system designed to be able to exchange it for any number of things. Well, if value breaks down purely to sentiment, then how are we going to compare or analyze the three functions of money through the lens, the scientific lens, the objective lens of thermodynamics? So this was kind of the trick. This was where I kind of got a little stuck because that makes no sense, right? How do you do that? Well, what I decided is we needed a way to kind of talk about value and separate it from the truest, most base, most bare bones sort of value that you can extract from any one thing. Well, in order to do this, I had to observe physical processes. I had to not only observe them, but really analyze what's going on. So I'm going to walk you through some of this because this is, and if I get any of this wrong or if I'm out of line, again, email me, correct me, let me know. But I think I've nailed this one. So for photosynthesis, for example. Okay, let's look at photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis is what? It's how plants and algae and other, pieces of life out there extract energy from the sun. Well, not extract energy from the sun. Use the light that the sun sheds and, comes to our planet, uses that light to convert it into energy somehow. But what we understand of it, and I think some of the processes are still, black box, but I think we understand a decent amount of what's going on here. And we understand that there are basically 2 cycles that are going on inside this. And we have your chloroplast, right, which have the chlorophyll inside of them. And the light comes in and hits it. And there's a reaction. There's a couple of things that are going on. You have your 2 photosystems, and you have your electron transport chain. Whatever. And this system, the light comes in, and you pull in water. Okay, it uses water in this reaction. And by the end, you kick off an ATP and a couple of other things that, send it over to the Calvin cycle. And you also excrete oxygen. Well, that's a bit of a cycle that goes on between, the photosystems and the Calvin cycle. But if you go over to the Calvin cycle, you have, the stuff that comes in is carbon dioxide. Nope. Yep. I may have got that backwards. At any rate, it comes into the Calvin cycle. It uses the ATP kicked over from the photosystems, and it gives us a couple of things, but the main thing that comes out of this is sucrose. So you've got water and CO2 that come into the system with light, right? Light is the sort of what energizes the entire process. And it kicks out. The useful components are oxygen and sucrose. And that's what happens in this system. Well, if we stand back and kind of really try to look at this and try to decide where the value, where is the value? Where does the value come from? Where is the value manipulated? How is it changed? How does it turn into something of value? It's really hard to pinpoint any one thing. It's a system. And that's sort of my point here, is that everything is a system that, the flow of material and energy is not something that you can just stop and hold. But anyway, as we're looking at this, is it the light that's valid? Is that where the value is? Not necessarily. Is it the sugar and the oxygen that comes out? Well, I mean, to us that's valuable. Maybe to the plant that's not. Some of that's valuable to the plant, but the oxygen, surely, that's its immediate byproduct. That's what it's kicking out. So the oxygen isn't valuable. So this just kind of enforces the idea, or the concept, that value really is directly proportional to sentiment. Okay, so where is the value? You can look at the entire system from beginning to end, and you can realize that some of the things are valuable to the process, but subjectively, that's what we are saying we think is valuable to the process. But then there's the things that come off of it that are valuable to us, like the oxygen. But that's the waste. That's a byproduct of this system. So it's not something we can, stamp as valuable, objectively valuable. This is not something that we can do. So looking for value objectively, it's more subtle. It's more subtle than trying to quantify, the kinetic and potential energies and the matter and the materials and what's going on here. For example, if you were to say light is valuable to this process, right? Well, why don't we supercharge the process? Let's bring in a laser cannon and just aim it right at the leaf and turn it off. Well, obviously that's not going to happen. If we do that, we're just going to burn a hole right through the leaf. But objectively, was there a value loss? There wasn't. Well, what happened? The light hit the leaf. when the light hits the leaf normally, right, the process happens. But this time we have a high-powered light that hits the leaf, and it's so energetic that it causes other things to happen and other systems to come into play. And it, super energized the leaf, and things began to oxygenate, and it burned a hole through the leaf. So that's another process that could have happened. There's multiple processes that could have happened. Well, another process is, an animal coming by and eating the leaf. So if you're trying to find value from this perspective, you just can't. If I took a hammer and I was hammering a nail into a board, okay, to me, the value of this whole system, or the value of what I'm getting out of this, is hitting it with just the right amount of force and just the right angle that the nail goes into the board, okay? But that's totally subjective. If I, was the Hulk and I took the hammer and I smashed it as hard as I could and I just, splintered the wood all the way down, there is no value loss. The value loss is only subjective. What happened is there's a difference. Yes, there's a difference between what happened. One just lightly tapped the nail until it went in. The other one took, the kinetic energy and as much as it possibly could and just went right down through the wood and splintered the wood. But that's just the system of what happened. That's just what happens. So you can't really devalue anything. It's because everything is a part of a system. And just because one system works one way under one condition and works another way under different conditions doesn't add to or subtract any value from what is happening. All that is happening is that energy is being moved through systems. Okay, things are happening. Now there are some systems that just happen to be situated in just the right way to, when energy comes into the system, it reacts very certain ways and spits out things. There are systems that, depending on what their environment is and what sort of energy they're receiving, act differently in multiple different ways. So so value is purely subjective. So what I'm getting at is that all natural systems, all systems, because all systems are natural systems, are flows. There is no purpose to anything really, except for the purpose that we subjectively apply to it. So because all systems are natural systems, we need to understand that all systems are just flows. They just all flow. It's all a flow of material and energy from one point to another, from a system of... So objectively, there is no difference between something that is what we think of as being constructive and something that we think of as being destructive. A great example is a supernova, or, any number of those astronomical events, like super just explosive events that we look at and think of, man, what insane destruction. But it's not destruction. That's where a large amount of the elements necessary to create life come from. So it really is actually a creative, event, but really it's not, because that's just what we are applying to it subjectively. Another example would be electricity, right? The electricity in our homes is, we've got 120 volts in the US, right? And it oscillates at 60 hertz. Well, if suddenly we cranked it up to, 500 volts at 120 hertz, it would very likely fry every component in somebody's home, if not first just completely decimate the breakers. I guess you can't really decimate a breaker, and I don't know, maybe if the current and voltage is extremely high, you could do some damage, but yeah, So that can be destructive. That can be what we think of as destructive. So I hope I'm really conveying what I'm trying to talk about here, that what we see as value is purely subjective, 100%. Anything that you think of as having value is valuable to you because of how it makes you feel. So as much as it would be nice to be able to reduce, totally reduce value to something purely objective and quantifiable, it's just not possible, because there will always be some level of sentiment somewhere in there. So this is where we're kind of going with this, and this is what I've concluded. Now, there will always be a desired road for any one action or reaction to take. But what's interesting is that as long as sentiment, okay, and desire describes the process and not the value, there are no problems. We aren't having any issues as long as sentiment first describes the necessity, the process, instead of afterwards trying to describe and adhere a value to whatever has happened. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to say is, we can go back to photosynthesis, okay? So there's, from our perspective, subjectively, there is a desired way for this process to work, okay? So sentiment comes before. So first, what we want to have happen is that the sunlight hits the leaf, it goes into chloroplast, it electron transport, all that, the photo systems, and basically the whole process, okay, kicks out the oxygen and the sugar. That's what we want to have happen. And we want to have that happen as efficiently as possible. And in some greenhouses, we even maximize the efficiency by setting up lights with the spectrum that, with the spectra that is, maximizes what happens with the plants. What am I trying to say? So the energy usage that we're putting into the lamps is maximized. The usage of that energy is maximized because we are pumping out a very specific spectra for the plants. So our sentiment rests before the process. It rests as almost a definition of the process, okay? As long as it rests before the process, we're not having any problems. We will not have any issues whatsoever. The problems occur when we don't pay attention to that and we sit back after the process and look at what has happened or what the result is, and then try to adhere a value to that. So I scoured the dictionary and the thesaurus. I was trying to find, first of all, with the dictionary, a word that that could best kind of define what I had just described to you, and I couldn't. So I picked up the thesaurus, and this is what I've kind of stuck together for now. If there is a word out there, please let me know. But so what I've came up with is, quote, harmonized-state potential. So harmonized-state potential, okay? Or I guess you could just say HSP if you want. Let's break that down so you understand where I'm coming from and what I'm getting at with this. Harmonized state. So it's harmonized with desire, with sentiment. So the state, okay, of whatever is harmonized with how you want it to happen. So harmonized state potential. You get like potential energy, right? So you've got any one system. So this is what we are going to replace value with in what we're doing here. And this is the closest quantifiable way of looking at this that I've been able to come up with. If you can think of something else that, levels up, please let me know, but this is the best way I could possibly quantify this. So we want it to be harmonized with our desires, with what we want to have happen. Okay? And as long as we put the desire before the process and put it into harmony, put the process into harmony with our desires, then we don't have the issue with having to turn around and then try to adhere a value to it afterwards and really have no way to quantify it. So this is the best way you can quantify it, a value, with still giving it a value, but also making it quantifiable without having the issue of losing any way to, follow or quantify it afterwards by sticking a label on it. Okay, now earlier I said value is sentiment, right? So instead of using value, which clearly does not work for our purposes, if we're going to actually try to quantify what's happening here and give it some measurable anything that we can look at it with through the lens of thermodynamics in order to analyze money and value. Because value just won't work for our purposes. So instead, we are going to use harmonized state potential. It's a harmonized state, and it's right in its potential state, and it's ready to be used. It has potential energy ready to be used. Okay? So, or even if it's not loaded with potential energy, it's a harmonized state with potential, and meaning it can be used by applying potential energy to it. Or, you get what I'm saying. Okay, harmonized state potential. All right, so we have reduced value to something that we can quantify we have just totally reduced the sentimental part to something that to where it's irreducible. You cannot reduce it any further, because at its base, value is sentiment. There's no way around this. So the only way to turn this into a system where we can analyze it objectively through the lens of thermodynamics and like scientifically scrutinize and analyze it is by reducing the sentiment to its like most fundamental, undividable, irreducible form. So that's what harmonized state potential is. Okay? I hope you're following this. If you're not, again, please ask questions. Okay, so again, it's only partially sentiment, but it's not the part that we need to be able to quantify. So the part that matters that we want to be able to quantify is not the part that is sentimental.